this thing on? I have a good friend from years back. I wish he was here right now. He's much more charismatic than me. And if he was here right now after the song, he would have said, "Whoa!" Now, I'm more subdued than that, so I have to kind of say that was really good. Friends, I want you to know that Pastor Michelle is capable of getting anybody to do anything. She told me that I was supposed to take the book of the prophet Isaiah and talk about that, and then talk about the silent generation, and put all of that in about 13 minutes. I was supposed to dress appropriately for that generation. A black suit's all I could think of. That was kind of formal, except that I couldn't find the hat to go with it. Matt had a great hat. I didn't have a good hat. So I just brought my vacation Bible school hat. I don't know what else to do. As I said to somebody earlier, after 41 years of preaching, you'd think I wouldn't be nervous, but I've never preached to a group I wasn't assigned to. I was preaching in my own church, to my own congregation. I'm used to sitting out there with you, and it's different. But let me try. Let's talk about Isaiah. Now, I couldn't stand history when I was in school. I hated learning dates, so I'm not going to overburden you with a lot of dates and learning details. Let me tell you, the prophet Isaiah just covers about 200 years of history of the Jewish people, starting about 700 and something years before Christ. And it's an interesting story, and I would advise you to read it sometime. It's a great story, not only the prophet Isaiah, but the stories of the history of the people. We've been studying that on Wednesday night and Sunday morning now for almost a year, and it's overwhelmingly wonderful, even for somebody like me who's read the Bible I don't know how many times. But getting back to it, Isaiah, 200 years. I mean, our own country is just almost 250 years old, but 200 years. And it covers Isaiah, the prophet, actually is at least 3 prophets, because the one didn't live 200 years. So there's a first part of Isaiah, there's a middle part of Isaiah, and there's a last part. Because in the history of those people, the first part of Isaiah is about when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, or about to at least. And you've heard of the lost tribes of Israel? They weren't lost, they were scattered. And the Assyrians just kind of came in and moved them around, and they really ceased to exist as such. And then but Jerusalem got spared. The Judeans got spared through a miracle, which is another story. And for a few years. Then another group, the Babylonians, came along and destroyed Jerusalem and carried their people away to Babylon. They didn't scatter them, they just picked them up and moved them to Babylon. Not all of them, just the leaders. So you had a leaderless group left. And they stayed there for a long time. A whole generation. Oh, certainly a few of those who were originals probably went back eventually. But the second Isaiah is about that time when they're hoping to go back home, to rebuild their temple, which was destroyed, to put the city walls back together. And then the third to last section of Isaiah is some other prophet who's claiming that name in Isaiah's name, talking about that return when it happened. Because when a new king came in power, he said, "Wow, all these people here, send them back home. Give them some money to rebuild their temple and their city walls, and they won't be our responsibility anymore. They can just pay tribute to me." And so they start back. Now that's the nutshell idea of what Isaiah is all about. But let me share with you some scripture. Now, if I was really going to do this in the era of the silent generation, I'd be reading from the King James Version, but I'm going to spare you that because I'm sparing myself. That middle section that has to do with what's happening in Babylon, you've got to realize just how desperate they were. Not desperate in the same sense of the silent generation who went through the World War II and the Great Depression, but they were away from home, and they hated the fact they were there. And if you want to get a flavor for how much they hated it, all you got to do is go to the Psalms. And you go to the Psalms and you find Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion, that's Jerusalem. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for our captors ask us for songs, and our tormentors ask us for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And the psalm ends with this kind of word. O daughter of Babylon, you destroyer, happy shall be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Do you hear it? Do you hear that incredible vitriol? But then they get to go back. And second Isaiah, that middle part of Isaiah, he's encouraging. The first part of Isaiah is warning them, destroying is happening. You're fixing to be taken away into Babylon. You're going to be in exile. But the middle of Isaiah, the one who prophesied in the middle, we don't know who that was. All the stuff he's got crammed together in one book. He's hopeful. He starts out in his section saying, comfort, comfort my people. It's a cry to God to comfort the people. And ends the whole section with the scripture passage for today. The word has come down. They're going to go back. Listen to this. Isaiah 55, starting in verse 12. For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up cypress. Instead of the briar shall come up myrtle. It shall be to the Lord for a memorial, for the everlasting sign shall not be cut off. Joy. You shall go out with joy. You see, here's the message I have for us, is that God always wants joy for us. Always. We don't always find it, but it's always there, God's desire for us. If we go to the New Testament, in 15th chapter of John, we find these words of Jesus. As the Father loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. All right. Now I have given you the Old Testament and I've given you the New Testament. Let's talk about the silence and how this relates to it. I'm not a silent generation. I'm a early baby boomer. But Michelle says, you're the closest thing I got to it preaching to Joe. Been working with this book, I think all of us have, called Generations. And I can't pronounce her last name. Twenge? Something, Jean M. Twenge, PhD. Brand new book about the generations. And I say it because I haven't got the original, I've got what she quotes. How did they get to be called silents? Those born between 1925 and 1945, about. Time magazine, 1951. The most startling fact about our younger generation is its silence. with some rare exceptions, youth is nowhere near the rostrum. By comparison with the flaming youth of their fathers and mothers, today's younger generation is a still, small flame. It does not issue manifestos, make speeches, or carry posters. It's been called the silent generation, and so it was dubbed. Now, friends, my parents were part of that generation, and let me tell you something. It was not a silent generation. Not at all. But it was different. No one person in any generation fits the total profile of that group. We're all individuals. But when you take a collective group and you examine them as a group, you come up with some common characteristics. And they weren't the kind, for the most part, who were out there as their mothers and fathers had been. Strange things happened to that generation. Now, I'm not talking about those just born 25 to 45. I'm talking about my parents as their young adults raising a family in their young adulthood. Amazing things were happening. But reflecting upon what they'd experienced with their parents, many of them in the Great Depression, and some of the later ones with their parents experiencing World War II, or experiencing both, as my parents did, they marched into the 50s and the 60s with all kinds of things. There was expanded educational opportunities, which many of them didn't take advantage of. As a matter of fact, statistically, you can look at the numbers, and more women especially were getting college degrees, professional degrees, before that time than during that time. You wouldn't think that necessarily, but the strange thing happened was, especially with the women, and you have to say with the men too, because the men expected this and the women went along with it, I think. The men came back from the war, the boomers, and some of the silents, very, very few. Then through Korea into the 50s and 60s, and the women, instead of getting their education and professional training, became mothers and wives and thought that's what they ought to do. Not all of them, absolutely not all of them, but more than you would think. It became the norm then to have bigger families, since then we had baby boomers, bunches of them. My parents had 4 children, all baby boomers. Well, during that time period, when they were young adults, starting to raise families, rural electrical power expanded. The telephone became more common in more homes. The radio, which they had experienced in their youth, gave way to the television. The sacrifices they had made, their parents had made, and trained them to believe in, were modeled in that generation of silence then, as they marched into the jobs they could get to build homes and families as their first priority. First priority. Well, let me tell you, some of these people were. They weren't so silent. I had a list probably of about 50, but here's a few. Clint Eastwood, Evel Knievel, Steve Martin, George Lucas, Rock Hudson, Jane Fonda, Elizabeth Taylor, Elvis Presley, Barbra Streisand, Jimi Hendrix. Those were all silents. Robert Kennedy, Colin Powell, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Nancy Pelosi. And then we ought to say, the only silent who ever became president is our president right now. They aspired, yes, to be leaders, but they didn't aspire to that highest level and make it. They weren't silent. There was a prophet of their generation. The prophet of their generation. I say the, being the one most notable, Martin Luther King Jr. He was a silent. Was he silent? I don't think so. I remember myself hearing his speech. 1963, I have a dream. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today, he said. Let me tell you a story about that. A friend of mine, now deceased, when I was serving in Fayetteville, she was part of my church. Betty was retired there then, but she was the first black nurse to serve in the U.S. Navy Nursing Corps. She left Fayetteville when she was high school age to St. Louis to live with family so she could continue her education. Because Fayetteville didn't have a high school for the black kids. And she wanted that education. Now, she's really something. She wasn't just the first black Navy nurse. She went on and got more education, and she became, I don't know which hospital it was, but she retired as the head administrator for one of the labs for one of the hospitals in New York City. That's the caliber person she was. Incredible, incredible woman. One of her best friends when she was growing up as a little girl, a little black girl in Fayetteville, was a white girl that lived about 3 blocks away. And the white girl's mother found out about it and separated them, and they weren't able to talk anymore. When she moved back, she hunted down her friend, who was then deceased though, but she found that friend's daughter. And the daughter said to her, "Oh, Betty, I'm so glad to meet you. My mother talked about you all the time." Martin Luther King's dream, which at the time was maligned by many people, could not be squashed. His prophecy of hope, kind of like comfort my people, or go out with joy, it hadn't happened yet. It's still happening. It isn't totally there yet, but you see this prophet of the silent generation echoing something similar to what we heard from Isaiah as the people returned from their exile. So the people for the silent generation, as they changed the world, and the early silence and the later silences were quite different. It was the later silence who actually were mostly involved in the protest against Vietnam, not the baby boomers. We got caught up in it, but we weren't the instigators. We weren't the instigators of the sexual revolution either. It was the silence, at least the later silence, who did all that. And the later silence, mothers returned to work. These great pioneers of the civil rights movement, so many things happened. So many of those young women who went to college, if they did, just to earn their MRS degree, did, and raised families, and raised baby boomers, and some raised others who went on to do marvelous things. My own father, who came back from World War II, he actually joined the Navy when he was 17. Got in the last 6 months of the war, and then got out. Came back, married my mother. She gave up scholarships. She graduated top of her class to marry my dad and begin this family. Dad went to college, tried to. After 6 weeks, he said he'd go out on the train at that point in life, and came back home because he was about to flunk out. Now, Dad wasn't dumb. As he said, I was just having too much fun. And I knew I wasn't going to make it at this point. But he was a lifelong learner, and he put that in me. My mother and my father put that in me, and my sister, and my brothers. Go to school. Learn. Make everything of yourself you can. You see, these silents, they mirrored what happened with the folks in Israel or in Judea who returned. They mirrored it so well that when they came back in the early part of the 50s and 60s, we saw, some of you remember this, we saw a turn toward formality. The black suit and